Alright guys, so over the last couple of days, our conservative majority Supreme Court has been going absolutely ballistic with some terrible rulings. So, I got a couple of them lined up here for y'all. We're going to start off with the big news of the day, because the Supreme Court has just provided a big win to Trump, ruling that he has immunity for some acts in his election interference indictment that's currently being brought by Jack Smith. So, a little bit of details here. They say the Supreme Court on Monday raised the bar for prosecuting Donald Trump, ruling that he has immunity for some of his conduct as president in his federal election interference case, but maybe not for other actions, adding another obstacle for special counsel Jack Smith taking the case to trial. So, I mean, already it kind of looked like this case brought by Jack Smith, as well as the other ones that are still remaining against Trump, it already looked like they probably weren't going to go to trial and conclude before the election. So in terms of like the politics of this, how much will this current Supreme Court ruling actually affect whether or not Trump is going to be prosecuted before the election? I don't even know if that makes a difference per se, but they're definitely setting the precedent here that moving forward, at least, that the president of the United States, at least to a large extent, is totally above the law. Now, they continue here with some more details. They say, in a novel and potentially consequential case on the limits of presidential power, the justices voted 6-3, predictably, along ideological lines, to reject Trump's broad claim of immunity, meaning the charges related to his attempts to overturn the 2020 election results will not be dismissed, but they said that some actions closely related to his core duties as the president are off limits to prosecutors. And Trump, of course, responded to this saying, "Big win for our Constitution and democracy, proud to be an American." So that was Trump's response there. Now, again, they voted 6-3 along conservative lines, right? Trump picked several of these justices personally, right? Which I think in and of itself is kind of insane. But the broader claims here that are being made, the standards that are being set by the Supreme Court with this kind of a ruling, I mean, it's not ambiguous, guys. They're saying the president is above the law. And I think that's just totally insane. I mean, whether or not it's within his duties as the president, to me, that shouldn't necessarily matter. I mean, like, to some extent, I could understand you need to have the presidency to be like somewhat functional, and if they're constantly being bogged down by criminal prosecutions against them or whatever the case may be, I could see in like a hypothetical Bernie Sanders administration, they try to nitpick him and to go after him for everything they possibly can, and then the entire administration just gets bogged down. So I could see it on some things, but then also it's like, you know, if you have Obama, for example, who launched this, drone war around the world where a vast majority of the people they were killing for a huge chunk of the time were innocent civilians. I mean, these are war crimes. These are things that you should be able to be prosecuted for. I mean, right now, Joe Biden is violating both international and domestic law for something that you could argue is part of his presidential duties in his foreign policy in regards to Israel, but he's sending them weapons illegally as they are using those weapons for war crimes and human rights abuses, etc. So, like, when it comes to things that could potentially be, argued are under the purview of presidential actions or presidential authorities, there are still definitely things that you should be able to be prosecuted for. So even like drawing that line to me doesn't really make any sense. Now, with Trump specifically, again, it comes down to a question of, well, what part or what parts of his, attempt to overturn the election by throwing together these fake slates of electors and calling people on the phone, like the Secretary of State down in Georgia, and trying to pressure them to find 11,000 votes and things like that. Like, it just becomes a question of which parts of these are technically, I guess, presidential actions and which parts are beyond the purview of that. I mean, again, a lot of this is seemingly still vague. Now, they say Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, said that further proceedings are needed in lower courts to determine what conduct Trump can be prosecuted for. Among the conduct that the court has determined to be core presidential powers and therefore subject to immunity are Trump's contacts with the Justice Department officials. Trump is also presumptively immune from being prosecuted for his contacts with Vice President Mike Pence in the weeks leading up to the January 6th attack on the Capitol by his supporters. The indictment alleged that Trump sought to pressure the Justice Department to investigate unfounded claims of widespread election fraud as a part of a plan to keep himself in power despite Joe Biden's election victory. And Trump also wanted Pence to refuse to certify the election results as part of his ceremonial role at the joint session of Congress on January 6th. And then they finish off down here, they say, at a minimum, there will be further proceedings before the U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkin to determine what, if any, of the other conduct alleged in the indictment is protected. And among the acts that she will review to determine if they are subject to immunity are Trump's contacts with people outside the federal government, like I said, with the state election officials such as the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, whom Trump pressured to reject the results showing Biden's victory. So again, there you have it. I mean, I don't politically know how much of an impact this was going to have because, again, I don't think that this trial was going to end up concluding before the election. It really should have, but we had all of this, gunk that was thrown into the works with Trump's appeals and challenges, and now, these court proceedings and all of this that basically, gave Trump the victory to say, if you win in November, then all of these major, the most important cases that were brought against you are really just not going to matter, because then he will be the president and they're not going to be able to prosecute him. So, I mean, all of this kind of led to Trump getting a victory in that sense. And it's also led to the Supreme Court coming out and basically expanding the ability of presidents to be immune from the consequences of their criminal actions. I mean, this is kind of insane, right? Now we move on because we got a couple other cases to get to here. So we had the Chevron Doctrine that was essentially ripped into shreds by the Supreme Court recently. Now, we're going to read some of the details here. Essentially, what this is doing is completely undercutting the ability of our federal agencies like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, or, other ones, I don't know, the FTC or the FAA or whatever the case may be. It's undercutting their ability to interpret laws that were passed by Congress and then interpret them through their expertise in whatever their field is, and then to apply that with any sort of regulations or with any sort of, actions these executive agencies may take. So effectively what this is going to do is it's going to transfer a bunch of power from these federal agencies to a bunch of random judges around the country who will basically, whenever some sort of a lawsuit is brought against the EPA, instead of deferring to the expertise of the scientists at the EPA, they're going to basically get to make their own conclusions, as if they know what the fuck they're talking about. So this decision is honestly going to have, I think, by far, the biggest impact of any of the cases that I'm telling you about today. So this is a really important one here. They say, executive branch agencies will likely have more difficulty regulating the environment, public health, workplace safety, and other issues under a far-reaching decision by the Supreme Court. The court's, again, 6-3 ruling on Friday overturned a 1984 decision, colloquially known as the Chevron Doctrine, that has instructed lower courts to defer to federal agencies when laws passed by Congress are not crystal clear. And, it is crystal clear why Congress would pass sort of like ambiguous laws, right? Because if you want to give the EPA the authority to regulate, to make sure that we have clean water, right? That is not something that your average member of Congress, right, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's not as if she knows when she's passing this kind of a law what specific amounts of what specific chemicals in what ways are allowable to make sure that our drinking water is safe, for example. And this applies, again, to every single federal agency that you could imagine. Basically, Congress doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about when it comes to most of these things, so they defer to the experts who work at the agencies. Now, are these federal agencies perfect? No, of course not. Are they, in many cases, corrupted, at least to some extent, if not a large extent? Yeah, absolutely. But you still need to have actual experts that are in place that can make these kinds of decisions in order to have a functional society, right? But this is part of the decades-long conservative war on what they call the administrative state, which, believe it or not, the administrative state is kind of important, again, to administering the state, to having a functioning state apparatus, regardless of whatever kind of disagreements I may have, right? But they continue here. They say, the 40-year-old decision has been the basis for upholding thousands of regulations by dozens of federal agencies, but has long been a target of conservatives and business groups who argue that it grants too much power to the executive branch, or what some critics call the administrative state. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the court, said federal judges must exercise their independent judgment in deciding whether an agency has acted within its statutory authority. So in other words, we're going to leave it up to a bunch of federal judges who don't know what they're talking about to make decisions on what kind of regulations make sense for the country. Does this make sense to you guys? Is this not totally ridiculous and insane? I mean, just some background on this. They say basically where this case came from was it was Atlantic herring fishermen, okay, stick with me here, who sued over federal rules requiring them to pay for independent observers to monitor their catch. The fishermen argued that the 1976 Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act did not authorize officials to create industry-funded monitoring requirements, and that the National Marine Fisheries Service failed to follow proper rulemaking procedure. I know this is getting in the weeds here, but just stick with me. They say in that case, right, or in two related cases, the fishermen asked the court to overturn the 40-year-old Chevron Doctrine, which stems from a unanimous Supreme Court case involving the energy giant in a dispute over the Clean Air Act. So that's where this case comes from. It originates with Chevron trying to challenge some sorts of regulations against them to make sure that we have clean air, right? That ruling, at the time, said that judges should defer to the executive branch, or in other words, the federal agency experts, when laws passed by Congress are ambiguous. And again, the laws passed by Congress have to be ambiguous, right? Because Congress members don't know what they're talking about when it comes to many of the details on these things. They say in that case, the court upheld an action by the EPA under then-President Ronald Reagan. And in the decades following the ruling, Chevron has been a bedrock of modern administrative law, requiring judges to defer to agencies' reasonable interpretations of congressional statutes. And so here's what's at stake now that this has been overturned. They say with a closely divided Congress, presidential administrations have increasingly turned to federal regulation to implement policy changes. Federal rules impact virtually every aspect of everyday life, from the food that we eat, the cars that we drive, to the air that we breathe, and the homes that we live in. President Joe Biden's administration, for example, has issued a host of new regulations on the environment and other priorities, including restrictions on emissions from power plants and vehicle tailpipes, and rules on student loan forgiveness, overtime pay, and affordable housing. So this could really throw a wrench in and really fuck up, a massive portion of what allows us to make reasonable changes. To make sure that the air we breathe is clean, the water we drink is clean, to make sure that we have a, habitable environment, to make sure that we don't have a bunch of asbestos in our housing or whatever the case may be. There are so many different layers of our country, of our society that are going to be affected by this. It's almost unimaginable how much damage this decision is going to have. They finish off here. They say those actions and others could be opened up to legal challenges if judges are allowed to discount or disregard the expertise of executive branch agencies that put them into place. I mean, just think about that, guys. We're going to have a bunch of corporate-backed sort of legal groups that are going to bring a bunch of challenges to every regulation you could possibly imagine. And then we're going to count on some federal judge who can completely disregard the actual expertise of the people who work at these agencies and then make decisions based on nothing at all, based on their own personal opinions, based on their own biases, based on their own, potential corruption. I mean, this is as damaging as you could possibly imagine. This is going to make it infinitely more difficult for even a good president to do mildly good things when you have the obstacle of Congress that won't allow you to get your full agenda put into place, right? So there you have it. Bad thing number 2, I guess, in the bucket there. Now we move on to bad thing number 3. Here from the Associated Press, divided Supreme Court rules in major homelessness case that outdoor sleeping bans are okay. So effectively what this is the Supreme Court saying that even in circumstances where any given local government is not providing enough place, enough housing, enough resources for homeless people to sleep, and they have to sleep outside because there's no other options for them, even in those circumstances, where you don't have enough government resources given to people who are homeless, you can still criminalize sleeping outside. In other words, this is criminalizing homelessness. This is giving the okay for that. Not like we weren't necessarily already doing that already, but this is giving the firm okay to it. And the actual story that's behind what brought this case to the Supreme Court is even more insane. So they say here, the Supreme Court cleared the way for cities to enforce bans on homeless people sleeping outside in public places on Friday, overturning a ruling from a California-based appeals court that found such laws amount to cruel and unusual punishment when shelter space is lacking. And it's like, yeah, of course it is. What do you're going to go around, do sweeps of homeless encampments and throw them into jail, give them tickets that they can't pay? I mean, if you're throwing them into jail, then, you're spending all of this money on keeping this person imprisoned for the crime of being homeless, right? Which, by the way, all of us, anybody who's watching this video right now, you are far closer to being homeless than you are to being a millionaire or a billionaire, right? This could happen to anybody. who just, happens to be down on their luck. They get fired from their job. They're, suffering from addiction, mental, health issues, whatever the case may be. So many different avenues to potentially becoming homeless. And they're saying even when there's not enough shelter space in any given city or in any given town, they can still criminalize people for sleeping outside in public spaces. I mean, they say in a 6-3 decision along ideological lines, the High Court found that outdoor sleeping bans don't violate the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. And I really don't know how else you could possibly describe it. Cruel and unusual punishment. Yes, it is cruel to, have police brutally go and crack down on people for being homeless, especially when you're not providing them with the resources to not be homeless. They say Western cities had argued that the ruling made it harder to manage outdoor encampments in public spaces, but homeless advocates said punishing people who need a place to sleep would criminalize homelessness, and of course it would. That's literally the definition of what they're doing here. But on top of that, notice the words encampment. Encampment in public spaces. What does that remind you guys of? Well, it reminds me of some of the recent protest encampments that we've seen on college campuses at public universities all across the country. That, yes, many of them were already being brutally attacked by the police, but this is essentially, I don't know how this ruling couldn't apply to that as well. To say, well, it's, legal for the city to come in and, remove this encampment because now it's illegal for you guys to be sleeping on public spaces, right? So how does this not also apply to cracking down on people's First Amendment right to go and protest via an encampment, which has been a time-honored, protest tactic for decades, right? So this could also potentially jeopardize, some of the protest encampments that we have seen protesting Joe Biden's genocide in Gaza. Now, they also say in California, which is home to 1/3 of the country's homeless population. That's insane. Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom said that the decision gives state and local officials the authority to clear unsafe encampments from the streets while acting with compassion. While acting with compassion. I want you guys to pause on that. That's something that actually just came out of the mouth of Gavin Newsom, that it's showing compassion to use police to go and clear encampments. He says this decision removes the legal ambiguities that have tied the hands of local officials for years. And again, the case that was behind this ruling, they say it came from the rural Oregon town of Grants Pass, which appealed a ruling striking down local ordinances that fined people $295 for sleeping outside after tents began crowding public parks. Real smart idea there, right? To fine people in the first place, you're going to fine people $300, people who are homeless. Believe it or not, I don't think they have $300 lying around. What are we doing? They say the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which has jurisdiction over the 9 western states, has held since 2018 that such bans violate the Eighth Amendment in areas where there aren't enough shelter beds. So again, this is in a place in Oregon that does not have enough shelter beds for homeless people. And I believe one of the only shelters that they had in Grants Pass specifically required people who were staying there to attend church. So we're adding religion into this mix, which also has its own, issues constitutionally as well. But so you're not providing enough resources for people to not sleep out on the streets. And then you're going to turn around and you're going to fine them and then potentially have them arrested for being homeless, guys, for being homeless. We're not, making sure that healthcare, including mental health care, is a universal human right. We're not making sure that we have enough addiction services and resources for people on that avenue, to escape a terrible situation. We're, first and foremost, not providing people with universal housing, which you would think would be step one to addressing homelessness. So we're not doing any of those things. We're instead just trying to criminalize and hide homelessness. That's what we're doing. I mean, it's just, again, it's a broken society. Now, we finish off with this here. Because on top of all of that, on top of, eviscerating the ability for federal agencies to do their jobs, on top of allowing Trump and, future presidents to have expanded authority to commit crimes, and on top of criminalizing homelessness, the Supreme Court also just made corruption and bribery even easier in this country, which I honestly didn't even think was possible. I thought we had already maxed out on that. Apparently not. They say here from Jacobin, the court's conservative supermajority ruled 6-3. Once again, are you guys noticing a pattern here? 6-3. In Snyder v. United States, overturning the 2019 corruption conviction of an Indiana mayor who pocketed $13,000 from a local business tycoon after ensuring that his company got a major town contract. The justices ruled that such bribes were not against the law. And they say, as we reported in March, powerful business groups, again, another through line here. You notice how it's always powerful business groups and conservative think tanks that are leading the charge in making society worse? Maybe there's something there. I don't know. But they say that they helped engineer this new ruling. The effort was part of a decades-long push by corporate interests to limit the scope of laws prohibiting corruption and bribery. So they say it's undisputed that this law criminalizes quid pro quo bribery. In other words, giving cash to a politician in exchange for an agreed-upon favor. But the question that the Supreme Court justices were deliberating on is whether this statute also covers gratuities, rewards that are given after the fact to a politician as a thank you for their corrupt action. So in this Snyder case, prosecutors argued that the mayor rigged the town procurement process to award 2 contracts, together worth over $1 million, to a local garbage truck company, and then within weeks, a company executive wrote Snyder a check for $13,000. The executive of this company, I guess, later testified that the mayor, who was struggling financially at the time, had demanded the money. Guys, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? So, it's already difficult enough to have any politician in the United States prosecuted for corruption. You basically have to have it like caught on camera of some person handing them a bag of cash, and you also have them on audio, and the politician is saying, in exchange for you giving me this bag of cash, I will do XYZ corrupt actions for you. This is a deal we are making. I am corrupt. That's what you need in order to prosecute a politician for corruption in this country. Now they're basically saying, in order to prove that it's corruption, you basically have to do what I just said before the fact, right? So now they're basically saying, if the bribe comes after the policy decision is made, then it's not a bribe. Can you guys tell me how that makes sense? So this mayor can give $1 million to a local garbage truck company. And then as long as that company waits until after the fact, after he does this, to give him thousands and thousands of dollars because he's going through some financial troubles, then that's totally fine. We're basically just doing like a quid pro quo, but in reverse, right? The corrupt action comes first and then the money reward comes afterwards. I mean, guys, this should not be complicated. This should not be controversial. I mean, we already have enough issues as it is when it comes to super PACs and just campaign finance in this country in general, where you have corporations, billionaires that can dump basically infinite sums of money into our electoral process in order to pick the candidates that they know will go and act on their behalf. I mean, there is just so much obvious corruption and bribery that is legalized in this country that I genuinely didn't think it was possible to expand that. But here we go expanding it. And let's not forget here, guys, that these kinds of decisions are being made by a wildly corrupt Supreme Court. I mean, you had, speaking of gratuities, speaking of like gifts, you had Justice Clarence Thomas, who was caught trying to cover up the fact that he was getting, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars worth of gifts from a right-wing Republican mega donor, Harlan Crow, right? Who was paying for all of these different luxury trips and a RV van and his grandson's education and his mom's house. And he also had business before the Supreme Court that Clarence Thomas wasn't recusing himself from. So, and he tried to cover all of that up. So it's like, this is a broken and corrupted institution in a broken and corrupted society. So just to recap, we have making corruption and bribery further legalized than it already is, even though that shouldn't even really be possible. We have criminalizing homelessness, even more so than we already have been. We have the Trump decision effectively granting, expanded authority for presidents to commit crimes and be completely immunity from being prosecuted for those crimes. And then we have, finally, the Supreme Court eviscerating the ability for our federal agencies to actually do their job, so that we have clean water, clean air, we have planes that don't all the time fall out of the sky, basic things like that to keep a society functioning. And this is the kind of avenue that our Supreme Court has been on recently. So I don't know what it's going to take to get some sort of meaningful change after this. I mean, as of right now, there are some things that are on the table, right? People suggest packing the courts which I think could be a good idea. People suggest getting rid of the lifetime appointments. I think that could also be a good idea. You know, one of the pushbacks to that is people will say, oh, well, then it's going to get, you know, politicized, and there'll be essentially political actors instead of neutrally interpreting the Constitution or whatever the fuck. And it's like, I hate to break it to people, but they're not doing that. They're already hyper politicized. Who are we kidding? So I don't know. We need a complete and utter overhaul of this entire institution if we're going to continue pretending like it has any legitimacy whatsoever.
Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying